to our webinar. So if you're joining us, I'm sure you're familiar with DFW Environmental Pros, but this is a free networking group. It's unofficial, so that's kind of the beauty to it. No cost, no pressure, there's no requirements. So we do something every single month, whether it's meeting up in person or doing some type of webinar. So again, it's free, so why not? You know, great way to meet other like-minded professionals. So here's our team of gals, the 3As, Alyssa, Abby, and Ashley. So we started this group about 3 years ago now and have been doing these monthly meetings ever since. So just a great way, like I said, for us to connect with other professionals in DFW. And it really gives us a good sense of, you know, maybe things we're not exposed to on a regular basis. I know for me, I'm much more on the, you know, compliance side versus sustainability side. So I get to see a lot of things within this group maybe I would normally see. So a lot of benefits, so welcome. And hopefully you're already following our LinkedIn page. You know, we do share job postings, upcoming events from other environmental groups or safety groups. Because I also do a lot of EHS. So, you know, very much trying to kind of share as much helpful information and event sharing as we possibly can. We'll also spotlight people. Maybe they're looking for a new role or just want to be spotlighted in general. So definitely make sure you're following us. Just a little bit about me. So like I said, my name is Abby Holovach. I have my own business, Vibe Environmental. So I spend a lot of time, of course, doing a little bit of everything under the EHS sun within my business and training, as well as a lot of time volunteering. So I'm very involved in American Society of Safety Professionals. And then, of course, our group, DFW Environmental Pros. So not going to really talk about myself much, though, but those are just a few of my critters on the screen. You may hear my rooster, Harriet crow. He gets excited when I present. So what we're all here for today. PFAS, the forever chemical, notorious. So kind of a dramatic title, you know, but you got to spice it up here. Unseen, unregulated, and unfolding. Totally true, though. It's all still unfolding. But it's crazy when we look at like the timeline, how long this has been going on. Like I'm talking back to like the 50s. So this is not a new subject, but for a lot of people, even when I bring up PFAS, if I'm like teaching a course, like a HAZWOPER course or something like that, and we're talking about, you know, different types of chemical exposures and acute versus chronic, you know, and some of these long-term materials that are sticking around in the environment. And a lot of them have never even heard of PFAS. They don't even have any idea what it is. So it's just crazy to see the progression. So we're going to look at this from start to finish and really what's happening in our own backyard and what does the future look like. So PFAS, better known as those forever chemicals, we know this is one of, if you're in the environmental industry, one of our most significant issues that is just continuing to snowball. So whether it's, you know, the public, our communities, industry, utilities, the regulators, etc., everybody is sharing the piece of the pie here in terms of we're all going to feel the impacts. We are already feeling the impacts. And one of the recent developments that has been particularly interesting to see and watch unfold, and the type of thing we're going to get into the discussion, is what's going on in Johnson County. So out in the ranch lands out there. So drinking water concerns, wastewater treatment challenges, and, you know, potentially and more than likely multi-million-dollar infrastructure investments across cities within DFW. So there's going to be a lot of adjustments that need to be made in terms of wastewater treatment and our drinking water, and it is not going to be cheap. So that's what we're going to look at. How did this develop? How did this become a global challenge? And how did it get in our backyard? What do these regulations look like that are incoming and kind of our status now? Because we're still seeing changes. And then, you know, what can we be keeping our eyes out for? So if you know, are an environmental professional or EHS professional at a facility, you'll have some actionable takeaways as well. So as I mentioned before, PFAS are not new. They've been manufacturing PFAS, using it since the 1940s. But of course, what's changed over that, you know, 86-year time span, for heaven's sake, is, you know, its environmental persistence. That's why it's called the forever chemical. What it's doing to us with this chronic exposure, human exposure, and what that looks like from a toxicology perspective. Also, you know, new analytical capabilities. I know when I was working for a hazmat spill response company trying to profile waste that was like soil impacted by AFFF foam, it was tough finding a lab that would actually do the type of PFAS testing that the landfills wanted because it was so new and like, fresh on the scene. And then, of course, we're seeing new regulatory expectations. But for decades, for a long, long time now, a lot of this contamination went undetected. There wasn't really a lab test that could find PFAS in drinking water, wastewater, solid waste. So again, how are you going to know it's there if we're not able to detect it to begin with? But now we are seeing more tests come out. So over the past 5 years or so, we've seen a lot of acceleration here. Now they can get down to parts per trillion when it comes to testing for PFAS. So previously, of course, it would have gone undetected, but now we've just got more tools at our disposal. So as we'll talk about, definitely something you may run into if you're dealing with any type of waste stream that could have potentially involved a PFAS component. Now we have tests that can support that determination. So like we said, the forever chemical PFAS, and I always get kind of tongue-tied when I'm trying to say it, but per or polyfluoroalkyl substances. So that's where the acronym is coming in. But it is a large family of synthetic fluorinated compounds, and the beauty and the curse to this compound is the structural feature. So it's this carbon chain where hydrogen atoms, like you can see in the diagram, are partially or fully replaced with fluorine. And this makes it really, really strong. So it's heat resistant, water resistant, oil and grease resistant, resists environmental degradation. So, while that's a great thing in terms of its applications, that's the very issue though, is this isn't going to break down like, a normal substance, and many substances would. So at this point, it's estimated there's more than 15,000 individual PFAS compounds, some variations of this, that exist today. So, all this stuff going on in labs, they're kind of Frankensteining it, moving things around. But again, these bonds are so strong. And again, it's a beauty and a curse. So like we said, though, it's not just one substance. It is an entire class of chemicals. So there are a lot of acronyms that we'll see. Like PFAS is just, kind of this overarching terminology. But there's a breakdown here like PFOA, PFOS, and then all the other acronyms that you can see here. And we'll come back to these when we talk about some of the standards that are coming into play. So again, it's not just PFAS. There's a lot that goes underneath that umbrella. And each of those does behave a little bit differently. And they will have some differences in that toxicological profile. Like, so how is that going to affect people and the environment? So that carbon-fluorine bond, like we said, that's the problem here. That's what made it so great, quote unquote, to begin with, but it's also the issue. So this is one of the strongest bonds seen in organic chemistry. So that means, again, highly resistant to degradation, very stable under extreme conditions. It's not going to break down. It's resistant to things like oxidation, hydrolysis. So like we said, the strength is the reason it works so well, but that's why it persists in our environment for so long. And this is why it's so difficult to get rid of once it's present in the environment or present in your body. So while most contaminants we will see, of course not all of them, there's a lot of very persistent contaminants, but most of them, like petroleum, many solvents, many products, they will break down naturally, but PFAS doesn't do that. Like we said, it has those strong carbon bonds, it's going to remain intact, and it continues to cycle through our environmental systems, and we'll look at together kind of what that looks like. So that's why we see them persist. They migrate, they accumulate, and then we see them recycling through these environmental systems from, getting into our drinking water, getting into our bodies, getting into biosolids, and then the process continues. So they're just continually being passed around, essentially. So that's why they're called forever chemicals. Because they're very hard to get rid of, and they're constantly recycling through this process. So there are two different types. Oh, Alyssa, yes?
Hey, I was just going to say one thing. When you were talking about how, and I always say PFAS, so how are you supposed to pronounce it? PFAS or PFAS? That's random. But my other question was, or thought, is, we talk about, oh, well, it's been around since the 1940s and 50s. but why has it become an issue now? And if you think about it from an industrial and just global perspective, supply chain, everything, because the bonds are so strong and they do bioaccumulate and all of that, we're probably seeing the impact due to that, the amount that it's bioaccumulated, right? Like it's been
Yep.
there, but just not at a observable level. Or is it a lab test thing, like you were mentioning before? Like, why
Probably
haven't we
both.
sounded the alarm before?
Yeah, but I would both definitely. And we're actually, after we kind of get through this, just introductory broad chemistry stuff, we're actually going to look at that and kind of like, the information we've known for a long time and then why it's only just now becoming a big deal because it's kind of a culmination of everything you just described. And then in terms of calling it PFAS or PFOS, I mean, I think that's, tomato, tomato. Roll with whatever you want to. But great points. And again, we're going to definitely dig into those a little bit more. So, like I said, there's two different types: long chain, short chain. So, long chain, this is our typical PFOA, PFOS. So, greater bioaccumulation potential. So, they're going to stick around a little bit longer, more extensive toxicity data at this point that we have access to because they've done a lot of research on these because this is typically what was utilized in industrial settings and as well as non-industrial. Versus our short chain, thankfully, these not thankfully, sorry, I'm not so good, is that they're more mobile in groundwater. I was going to say less mobile. No, they're more mobile, which of course that's even more problematic because the last thing we want this is getting into our groundwater. That's how it gets into the environmental chain. Unfortunately, they're also less studied because a lot of these are kind of some of the newer, Frankenstein laboratory versions. And so while they are being used as replacements for phased out, PFOA, PFOS, the long chain, it's kind of like into the frying pan and into the fire. It may be quote unquote, shorter chain and, they were thinking maybe it might be safer, but unfortunately, like we said, they are still environmentally persistent, very mobile in the groundwater. And then it's going to be difficult to get that out of the water with our conventional methods. So replacing one with another has not really done us any favors. So, of course, industry has loved PFAS for many years, though, because all of these benefits we've talked about. Fire and heat resistance. That's why we see it in the non-stick cookware. Same for corrosion and chemical resistance for different industrial settings. Non-stick properties, like I said, our cookware. Water repellency. So water-resistant fabrics, so like a lot of the stretchy pants, people's underwear, for heaven's sake, a lot of it has some PFAS component. Same for oil repellency. So again, while these were great qualities in application, unfortunately it came with a really high cost. So PFAS has been used, like we said, industrial applications. Most commonly we see it with things like firefighting foam, especially at airports, and in military bases, big problem. Chemical manufacturing, metal plating, aerospace and semiconductors. And then of course, in our own homes, all these consumer products. So, the first one kind of on the scene to be identified early on, as we'll talk about, was Teflon. Even our stain-resistant carpets, again, those waterproof clothes, even our food packaging and our cosmetics all have some level of PFAS. So, again, it was embedded within all of these products from a consumer perspective and the industrial perspective. So this is where we kind of look at that timeline. So 1940s is when commercial PFAS production began. And then we saw rapid expansion into those consumer and industrial products in the 50s and then the 70s. Now, what's crazy, though, is you kind of look at this timeline over on the right-hand side of the photo. 1956, Stanford University researchers determined that PFAS adheres to proteins in human blood, ultimately leading to their nickname later on as forever chemicals. So they had already discovered in 1956 that it was adhering to proteins in human blood. So again, very unfortunate that it's gone on for this long. Then we get in the 80s and 90s, so widespread use across multiple sectors. And over that time frame, so from the 50s to the 90s, here's a few of the discoveries. DuPont discovered in 1965 that PFAS exposure caused liver damage and enlarged spleen, and that should say in rats. 1978, 3M determines that the chemical used to create Teflon should be considered toxic. And in 1989, 3M showed higher cancer rates among workers who handled or were exposed to PFAS. So they're finding all of this information out behind the scenes, but industry is just continuing to blaze forwards with all of this. So it wasn't until the early 2000s, and we'll talk about some reasons why it reached a head here. That's when our scientific concerns finally began to get attention. So 2001, 3M submitted studies on PFAS toxicity to the EPA. Then in 2010, finally we start to see some regulations emerge at the state level. So like in 2016, the EPA issued health advisory recommendations for drinking water standards. In 2020, this is where we start to see some federal regulation movement. So for example, at the state level in 2018, New Jersey became the first state to set enforceable limits for PFAS. And then as we'll talk about in 2024, we actually saw some drinking water standards. But again, it's been over 80 years that this has been going on. So in 2021, DuPont, Chemours, I think that's how you say their name. I always messed up that company's name. And Corteva, they actually reached a $4 billion cost-sharing agreement to settle lawsuits involving PFAS. And as we'll see, this is just going to become more and more of a litigious issue. So this has been going on for a long time. So how does it get in the environment? So a multitude of ways here. So, of course, like we said, firefighting foam applications, discharges from industrial facilities. And it could have been from, stormwater runoff. It could have been from, any other types of maybe illicit discharges. A big one that we'll talk about is landfill leachate. So, anything that goes into a landfill, of course, there's going to be kind of those trash juices and things like that accumulate. And they've got systems that will collect it. And then that gets collected and it gets sent through into the wastewater, like the local POTW, that, publicly owned treatment works. So that's an issue, that source, which then causes wastewater treatment system issues. We'll talk about biosolids, that land application. That's the specific issue we're seeing in Johnson County. Like we said, stormwater runoff and just general product degradation. But the problem is, once it's released in any one of those forms, then it's going to move potentially between multiple environmental media. So it gets into our surface water, it can get into our soil, our groundwater. We consume it, and then the whole process starts again. So PFAS is highly mobile. We mentioned that about like our short chain PFAS variations that we've seen, some of our newer variations, but all of them are very mobile. So moving quickly through our soil, groundwater, surface water, which then of course is consumed by, uptake by vegetation, consumed by livestock, by humans. So PFAS does readily migrate. And again, another big problem, because it is then a regional issue versus site specific, because what happens in one area could affect something happening in an area miles and miles away. So again, not only does it bioaccumulate and stick around, but it's also passing itself around, essentially. So for us as humans, how are we getting exposed? So our drinking water, this is the most significant pathway that we see. And again, this is where we see some regulation over the past couple of years, and we'll talk about that. Of course, it's in our food, because if the fish are consuming it, livestock are exposed, it's in the milk from the livestock, the crops are uptaking it, it's in our food. And of course, that's how we're ingesting it. And then all of these consumer products, it's like a nightmare when you start going through the list of everything that contains some type of PFAS. It's in pretty much, it feels like everything. It could be in blankets, it could be in, like we said, our clothing and our glasses that we've got on. So it's really insane how ubiquitous PFAS really is, some constituent. And then of course that occupational exposure. So like our firefighters, or those who have worked maybe in military bases for long periods of time, we've got this long-term exposure from the occupational perspective as well. And unfortunately, with all of these new studies that have come out, most Americans have some measurable level of PFAS concentration in our blood. So, we've got how many people on this call? 5 people on the call. So all of us have PFAS in our blood, pretty much. I'm not laughing because it's funny, but it's just, what are you going to do? And unfortunately, that's where we're at this point in time. So why EPA became concerned, and again, it took them long enough, for heaven's sake. It wasn't until the early 2000s, and again, we'll talk about the trigger for that, but EPA started to see through all of this new research, it is extremely persistent, it's extremely widespread, We've got data that it is bioaccumulating in humans, animals, etc. And we're seeing health impacts even at very low concentrations and exposures. And then not to mention the big ticket issue, how do we treat and remove it from, for example, our drinking water, our wastewater? So with all of this science evolving, all of this new data, that's where we started to see some new push, finally some regulation here, getting it regulatory attention. And that's why it's become just bigger and bigger of an issue. And even though it's slow in terms of regulatory movement, industry is definitely already feeling it. Most people have already phased out PFAS foam, for example, for firefighting foam. So, again, industry's having to move faster because we know it's coming down the pipeline. But like we said, it was these chemicals' properties of being so strong and so hardy that made them so popular in the first place. It was a technological breakthrough. So for much of the 20th century, we viewed it as, wow, this is like a miracle thing. Oh, it's so great. It's solving all these problems that we've struggled with. But unfortunately, as we know, it's creating all these challenges that we're facing today. And what makes it worse is a lot of these companies knew behind the scenes that this stuff was no good. But as with everything, money trumps all, and now, the earth and us have to suffer the consequences. So in 1938, started with DuPont. Actually, a chemist there named Roy Plunkett discovered this material called PTFE, later known as Teflon. But of course, this is a PFAS-related material that we're dealing with. So extremely slippery, chemical resistant, heat resistant, durable. So this is really what kicked off fluorinated chemistry, which is going to lead to PFAS as we know what it is today. So when you hear about Teflon, this is really where it all started. Now, World War II, they needed fluorinated compounds, military equipment, aerospace, chemical processing. So that's when we started to see this boom of fluorochemical production. So specifically from companies, as we saw earlier, doing some of the research, DuPont and 3M. So it went from just military base to, oh wow, it's got a lot of properties on the commercial side of things. And then that's where we started to see it become more of a consumer related application. So the 50s, 60s, and 70s, now they're putting it in our cookware, fabric protectors, fast food packaging, things like waterproof jackets and carpets. And of course, nobody knew what was going on. They had no idea PFAS was present. Like I said, you talk to people today, and many people have absolutely no idea that it's even a thing, in 2026. So, of course, and back in the day, they thought this was great. Now, aqueous film forming foam is obviously one of the things that, people have their eyes on and have tried to phase out here, but it served its purpose for a while in terms of being an amazing way to smother a fire, particularly at airports, military installations, refineries, anywhere where they had a lot of fuel, because essentially what it does is it smothers and removes that oxygen source for the fuel to continue to burn, or to continue to support this fire. So millions of gallons being used, whether it was, a vehicle catches on fire on the side of the road, they're spraying it down with foam. Well, where do you think the foam's going to go? It's going down the drain. Same for military bases. All of those hangars release their foam. Well, where do you think the foam's going? They're just letting it go out the door, back in the day. Which then all of that subsequently gets in the soil, gets into our groundwater, and becomes part of that cycle. So AFFF is one of the largest sources historically, just in terms of, it's spraying everywhere and it's getting into our groundwater with no problem. But of course, like we said, industry was more concerned with performance. They were like, wow, it works great. It's so durable and it's cost effective. They had no idea about the long-term toxicity, bioaccumulation, what it looks like from a waste management perspective. So like we said, it was everywhere. Now, where it started to get some attention is in the late 1990s. So West Virginia, there was a cattle farmer, and that's him right there, named Wilbur Tennant, and he started to see things that were really concerning, like dead and sick cattle. So, of course, this is his livelihood, that is now being affected. Strange animal behavior, like they were having some type of, toxicology issue. Water quality concerns, environmental damage, and he believed it was coming from a nearby DuPont landfill. Of course, at this point, no one really knew what PFAS was. But come to find out, DuPont was dumping PFAS waste in that landfill because, of course, it wasn't regulated. No one said they couldn't, but it wasn't, in a controlled and responsible manner, and it was getting into his drinking water, his groundwater, that, in very concentrated amounts. And then all of his cattle, his crops, everything else were all affected, obviously, as a result. So this is where the famous attorney in this case comes in, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Robert Bellot. If it's anything fancier than that, then I don't know. But he was initially a lawyer who represented chemical companies. But this farmer came directly to him and was like, hey, like, here's what's happening, gave him all this data, all these, basically proof. And he was so, changed by it in terms of what he was seeing that he was like, wow, there's something a lot bigger here going on. And he actually started to represent the farmer versus these companies he'd been defending. So that's when he started to see these internal company records, like all of that testing that 3M and DuPont were doing, saying like this stuff is toxic, but they continued to use it, didn't report it, didn't tell anyone. So that's where this kicked into action. So it became a local dispute, but blew up into a huge environmental investigation. And of course, everybody's seen like Aaron Brockovich and all that kind of stuff, but a lot of people have never heard of this for whatever reason. And probably we can deduce what that reason is. They don't want that becoming mainstream knowledge. So in this case, they were focusing on PFOA. So this is used extensively in Teflon manufacturing. So they saw, based off of all this data, that PFOA had gotten into the groundwater, drinking water. It had accumulated in residents from the testing they were doing. And they were like, oh my gosh, this is significantly more extensive than had ever been suspected. So the facility in particular near Parkersburg, this was in Washington or in West Virginia. So this is their Washington Works facility. So again, this was the source of where a lot of this material was coming from. So we saw, tens of thousands of impacted residents, large scale litigation. And this is where all this national media attention came in, because finally it showed, hey, PFAS, it's moving. It can go beyond facility boundaries and expose that entire community and affect everybody along the way. So as part of the settlement related to this case, this is where they put together the C8 science panel. So this is related to like the PFOA structure with the carbons. So this was supposed to be an independent scientific panel trying to see, is there a link between PFOA exposure and human disease? So this was one of the largest PFAS health studies that had ever been done at that point. So approximately 70,000 exposed individuals. They looked at years of health data, all of the blood results, and its findings, come to find out, are going to significantly influence all these regulatory decisions, because unsurprisingly, they found that a probable link does exist between PFOA exposure and health conditions like kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, and pregnancy-induced hypertension. So, there are still a lot of back and forth. Of course, there's a lot of money that's put into this in terms of, from companies that want to continue to use this and don't want to be held liable for previous use. So there's continuing to be pushback about specific risks, exposure levels, etc. But in general, again, these findings reshaped what we are seeing today in terms of now we're finally seeing regulation, that there is a probable link to cancer through PFAS exposure. So if you want to watch a movie this weekend and you've never seen it, Dark Waters, this was out in 2019, tells this story. So it goes through what the complaints, the investigation, getting into DuPont's operations. So really, for a lot of people, this was their first introduction to PFAS. And again, it's been used since the 40s, introduced in the, in the 50s. And 2019 took that long for people to finally start to, have some information about what is happening here. And for a lot of people, they've never even heard of this movie. Like we said, they never heard of PFAS. So, of course it's dramatized, but it's still a really great movie that chronicles this story from start to finish. But the importance of Dark Waters, like we said, is not just the contamination itself, but that it kind of busted open the doors for additional investigation. People are like, what the hell is going on here? You know what I mean? Like, how did it get this bad? Like, what is happening? So they finally started to see, like, this has been going on for decades. We don't have regulation. This stuff is mobile. And then when you start to try to be like, all right, well, how are we going to clean it up? Then the costs are enormous. So that's what we're seeing now, is the fact that what are we going to do now at this point? Because now we're in a real pickle. So what we saw within, the Dark Waters movie and this whole situation it's based off of, this is what opened the door for what we're seeing nationwide. So for us here in Texas, this is definitely going to hit home in what we're seeing in Johnson County. And just to note, I probably will go past 12:30. Again, you're welcome to stay, no pressure. But the West Virginia case, like we said, was more manufacturing related. Of course, coming from those, DuPont operations, so it was getting in their drinking water, community exposures. And for us here in Texas, like the case we'll talk about in Johnson County, this is actually coming from things like directly related to wastewater treatment plants, biosolids, which of course are accumulating PFAS from a variety of different sources, leading to agricultural land and livestock exposure, which then is going to directly connect to the pressures we're seeing now in our municipal utilities, regional water supplies, because they're the ones that are really on the front lines here trying to deal with this material. So a little bit different pathway, some different stakeholders, but it's still the same material with the exact same problems. So this is kind of how we see PFAS progress. So generation 1, manufacturing. Oh, wow, look at this, what we've discovered. How do we make PFAS? Then it gets into our consumer products. And we're like, oh, sweet, let's use it in everything. How can we use this stuff for its amazing properties? And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, crap, now it's in our drinking water. Now we're seeing health effects. And then we start to see it in biosolids and agriculture. How is it getting into our farms and ranches? So the Johnson County situation is really chapter 5, where we start to connect the dots, the Johnson County case, the case in West Virginia. This is where we start to connect all of these things back together. And again, this is why we're seeing acceleration in terms of regulation. So let's look at Johnson County. So what happens when PFAS gets into our wastewater treatment plants? It concentrates in biosolids, and then it gets applied to our land. So first off, let's look at what is a biosolid. So biosolids are really at the heart of the Johnson County situation here. So biosolids are treated sewage sludge coming from our municipal wastewater treatment plants. So while biosolids are great, again, in their own way, it's a way to recycle this material that would otherwise have to go, for example, to a landfill, which is not ideal. But unfortunately, if there's materials that are persistent, like PFAS, that are in our wastewater, well, it's going to be really concentrated in those biosolids. So this is a main troublesome area and potential pathway to spread this PFAS around. So, like we said, biosolids are coming from our wastewater treatment plants. It's the sludge, the chunks. So it's got organic matter. We've got nutrients and microorganisms. And then, of course, trace contaminants. Now, biosolids, like we said, they'll have a lot of benefit for use, for example, as a fertilizer. So could be used for compost, land applied, like they were doing out in Johnson County. And then, of course, it could be sent to the landfill, but that's, like we said, not ideal. So that's why land application became preferred. They were like, all right, communities, it's beneficial reuse. It helps, our crops grow, and then we're not taking up valuable landfill space. So this started in the 70s and 80s, where they were like, again, saw these benefits of biosolids, nutrient recycling, reduced landfill space, we're improving soil quality, and reduced commercial fertilizer use. So it's a lot of win-wins. This is a sustainability success story. So we've been using biosolids, again, since the 70s and 80s. So there is a specific federal program for biosolids, but when we talk about the regulations around them, it's all about what pathogens they need to test for or trying to, treat for. Are there metals present? What about vector attraction reduction? How does it need to be applied? But of course, PFAS wasn't even on the radar. So there's nothing within the biosolids framework of regulation that had anything to do with PFAS. So you think about it, we've been using PFAS since the 50s. We've been spreading biosolids since the 70s. Well, that's a lot of concentrated PFAS. We've been spraying and using as fertilizer in our agriculture, and then now we're consuming that material. So this is the cycle that I was talking about. So how does PFAS get into the wastewater treatment plant to begin with? Of course, pretty logical stream of thought here. Industrial and manufacturing facilities, they have wastewater treatment permits that then discharge to the POTW. Of course, coming off of airports, military installations, that landfill leachate that I told you about, and then all of these fire foam releases that are getting into the system as well. So these treatment plants, whether they knew it or not, were one of the ground zero for PFAS accumulation and, like we said, concentration in this biosolids. But as we said, regulations weren't meant for PFAS, and neither were the wastewater treatment facilities themselves. So their treatment facilities are meant to treat things like solids, suspended material, nutrients, pathogens, oxygen demanding substances. But it was not designed for PFAS in any manner. So that's a pickle to be in, because now that contaminant is just passing right through the system, and then again it's accumulating and concentrating in those biosolids. And you look at, of course, this is from 2019, this pie chart here, but land application made up 51% of the biosolid use and disposal. So that is a lot of PFAS being distributed. And again, this is why it's not a site-specific issue. This is very much a regional issue. So PFAS enters the wastewater treatment plant, and then it leaves through a few different pathways. Like we said, could be through the effluent. Like once they treat that wastewater, they could discharge, for example, to like the Trinity River or something like that. Well, they weren't treating for PFAS, so down it goes in the river, Same for our biosolids or any other residual materials from the treatment process. So essentially, these POTWs became the transfer point for PFAS, not any type of treatment or destruction technology. So this is why our municipalities are really feeling the pressure. So PFAS, like we said, could get in the treated effluent, which could be discharged in the river, our biosolids applied to the land, or those residual solids that maybe need to go for disposal, which then get into the landfill, which then become leachate, which then go back into the wastewater system. So now you can see we've just got this whole chain going. Circular management loop. So again, goes through our environmental systems. Consumer products become wastewater. Treatment plants make those biosolids, which then get applied to the agricultural land, which then gets into our groundwater, which then gets into our surface water, into our drinking water, and then into our bodies, and then now back to the wastewater treatment system. So this is the issue. Again, this is why PFAS is going to be probably, another 50 years worth of us trying to figure this out. PFAS does have an affinity for solids, though, which makes it worse. So that's why it's going to continue to increase in biosolids. Now it's really, really concentrated. And then we're applying it to these, large acreages, these farms. And then we've been doing it since the 70s. So unlike, for example, a leaking storage tank, we're spreading biosolid contamination all over the place. Numerous properties, numerous different areas, numerous different, groundwater areas being impacted. And it came from, for example, the city of Fort Worth. And now we're sending that biosolids out to Johnson County. So it's amazing how fast this spreads. So traditional contaminants, maybe we've got one facility, one release, one plume, like a Superfund site, one cleanup project. But PFAS is a nightmare because now we've affected hundreds of acres. Possibly, hundreds of landowners, surface water, groundwater, our livestock. So it has a massive footprint. So you look at that map right there, presumptive contamination sites. We've got things like military sites, major airports, wastewater treatment facilities, and industrial facilities with PFAS materials. And especially in the eastern side of the country, oops, sorry about that, it's completely almost, colored in. So very widespread. Of course, it gets into our livestock when they're drinking the water. They're eating those crops, potentially, ingesting some soil. And then it accumulates in their tissues, blood, organ. And so then what's happening to those animals? Well, we're eating them. So now we're exposed again. So again, this is why everybody on this call has some level of PFAS in your body. So farmers and ranchers were some of the first ones to start raising these red flags, like we said, in West Virginia and then here in Johnson County, because this is their livelihood. Healthy livestock, groundwater that's healthy and reliable, productive soils, and market confidence. But PFAS was hitting every one of those affecting every one of those. And so these were some of the first people to come kicking and screaming. So Johnson County really was the biggest stink and really the ground zero for Texas PFAS. So Johnson County is highlighted there on that little map. It's about 30 miles south of Fort Worth. So, you know, a lot of attention drawn out here. And this was within the past 2 years that this has all been going on. So started in 2024, I believe. So this drew attention from not only EPA, but of course the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, our regulators, as well as Texas legislature. They actually had to issue a disaster declaration because of the situation that was going on. So this is one of the most widely discussed PFAS issues in Texas at this point, because again, it was kind of like the West Virginia issue at the national level. Here in Texas, it was one of the most notorious at this point. So how this started. So it didn't begin with PFAS identification. Of course, that's not where we started. But all of these concerns and complaints started with biosolid application activities like, you know, hey, it stinks, there's strong odors, runoff observations, you know, having fish kills, my livestock are not doing well. So that was their first concern. Of course, they had no idea that it was PFAS in the biosolids. So in Johnson County, a rancher named Tony Coleman, he was the one who started to question things about what's going on here, you know, in terms of biosolids application and kind of connecting the dots here in terms of where, you know, I'm seeing health effects with my cattle. I'm seeing fish kills. What's going on here? So these are where these questions started to emerge and blew up into this statewide controversy. So ranchers, and specifically Rancher Coleman, he started to see, like I said, livestock deaths and sick animals. So these are some photos that were from an article from the Texas Tribune, probably the best one I think that covers the case in detail. But so again, real world photos, fish kills, changes in his water quality. You know, he was having dead, you know, stillbirths with the calves, you know, calves dying weeks after birth. So he was seeing some really extreme results in terms of what was happening here and where these exposures were coming from. So this kicked off the investigation, and there was a Johnson County investigator as a part of the county staff, and she went out there and started doing testing. So this is what started to draw attention because, hey, we're starting to connect these dots here. It's looking like there's high levels of PFAS in, you know, the deceased animals. You know, there's high levels of PFAS in the water. So this is where we start to see, how is it getting here? You know, how is it exposing and accumulating and the cattle are consuming it? So again, it kind of blew the doors off of what we had going on here in Texas. And so really this stillborn calf was one of the focal points. So this had, you know, 610,000 parts per trillion reported PFAS concentration. And so again, this is what really, you know, drew the spotlight into this as a highlighted regulatory issue. You know, now we've really got a problem out here. And how did this get here? This high of a concentration in this poor little calf. So it's what the numbers suggested. So this is what they were able to connect it to. These industrial sources getting into the wastewater, which got into those biosolids, which was then applied to land like Mr. Coleman's agricultural land, got into waterways, livestock, and accumulated, and then, of course, that's how it gets into our bodies. So these results with the stillborn calf highlighted and directly started to make these connections between these environmental systems. So, like we said, this is where they started to connect these dots. They said, all right, where are these biosolids coming from? Well, they were coming from, you know, the city of Fort Worth wastewater treatment plants. So these are just some, you know, photos from the article from the city of Fort Worth wastewater treatment plant. You know, of course, massive facilities, you know, very expensive facilities and equipment, but they're not equipped at this point to treat PFAS. There's some of the biosolids you can see that are being generated. And of course, like we said, that's the material that's going out for land application. So in 2025, due to all of these findings in terms of, you know, they were seeing all these results in the testing for the animals, the environmental testing, they were like, all right, this is so extreme and we're seeing such environmental impact that we're going to declare a state of emergency. Public health concerns, you know, of course, the impacts we're seeing agricultural and livestock, water resources, economic impacts. So like we said, you know, Texas, we weren't super concerned about it for a long period of time. And for them to get pushed to this point to where it was so bad that they declared a state of emergency, that just goes to show the severity of the situation. Now, what is interesting, though, is, and this is kind of just what I've heard through the grapevine, just a caveat, this is not something I have solid facts on, but, things like soils that were coming from a lot of these military bases that we have in the DFW area, back in like the 90s and stuff, all of that material, of course, was contaminated by PFAS because they use foam at those facilities. Well, that kind of material would then go for disposal at our local landfills here in Fort Worth, which then, of course, what does that lead to? Now we've got landfill leachate, which then was collected, in drains and then is deposited and sent to the Fort Worth POTW, which then generates biosolids. So those are the types of things where, again, we're seeing the direct connections and dots that were never connected before. So Sinagro was actually the company that was managing a lot of these biosolids. So there was actually a lawsuit that came out with the farmer that was out there versus Sinagro and said, what's going on here? Why is this not being, why is there no oversight here? Where does the liability lie? So at this point, it's become a very closely watched PFAS litigation measure here in Texas. And it's probably going to set the standard for a lot of litigation to come. So that's one of the biggest questions here is who owns the PFAS problem? Like I said, we've talked about the chain and how it gets into the biosolids and how it gets onto the land. But when it's coming from so many different sources like industry in the Fort Worth area, municipal activities, our firefighting activities for years, who are you really going to point the finger at here? Who's going to be held responsible for this? And that's the tricky question here. And there really is no way at this point to point the finger. But again, we're just going to see more and more increased litigation here. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops. So Johnson County, like we said, this is not simply a local problem. It was just another, feather in the cap of this whole situation. Another highlighted problem in terms of these broader questions about what's everybody else doing with biosolids across the country? Because that probably concerned a lot of POTW facilities that do these, biosolid recycling and reclamation processes. They're all looking at their own wastewater treatment facilities and being like, oh crap, what's going on with us? And where does this liability lie? Like I said, so it's really going to be a preview what we're seeing here in our own backyard, how this is going to look across the country. So definitely something to kind of keep your eye on because it will set the stage for what we're going to see to come. So again, Johnson County highlighted the issue, but in North Texas overall, we all face this broader challenge. Utilities, airports, installations, manufacturers, now they're all having to deal with PFAS issues, their water and infrastructure systems. So we're seeing a lot of things happening here in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. And Fort Worth, as we'll talk about, is actually one of the hot spots for some of this stuff. So like we said, it's not just a PFAS problem. It's not just limited to a few ranches out there, south of Fort Worth. We're seeing these issues across the board. Airports, military installations, these aerospace manufacturers, of course, our wastewater treatment plants. Our landfills are deeply concerned about it as well, and these firefighting training areas. So like we said before, this is so widespread. It's not a single site. We've got cumulative impact. This has been going on for 80 years. So, how are we going to get this genie back in the bottle? So DFW, of course, is particularly vulnerable because we've got a lot of airports, or not a lot of airports, but one of the busiest and largest airports, DFW Airport. Plus, we got Dallas Love Field, amongst other, vicinity airports in terms of, military installations and what they've got going on. Millions of residents generating wastewater daily, which, like we said, that's also another method for it to get into the environmental circle here. So we here in DFW had a lot of contamination sources, a lot of transport mechanisms, and then not to mention, the folks that are out in the oil and gas industry areas, like out in West Texas, forever chemicals have been used in fracking. So, a lot of oil and gas operations as well, they've been injecting this, deep into the earth, essentially. And those poor folks are seeing issues out there as well, just in kind of a different source and a different origination point. Now, AFFF, like we said, it works great to smother a fuel. It rapidly suppresses it, works exceptionally well, but it's one of our biggest sources of PFAS, so significant and highly concentrated. So this creates a big environmental liability, especially like we said, facilities that deal with aerospace, deal with any type of fuels. And unlike accidental spills, a lot of these were intentional and repeated. They didn't know it was going to persist in the groundwater and soil. So whether it was through a drill, maybe they just needed to drain the system. They were like, oh, no big deal. Let's just, let her rip. And then it all drains away. Like I know I worked at the Joint Reserve Base here in Fort Worth for a period of time a few years ago, and they were very, very concerned just because, they're at the heart of this problem. That's a military base with aircraft hangars using foam, for decades. They had phased out PFAS foam mostly at that point, but if we even had one drop from a system that did still have PFAS foam, we would have to report it, and it was like a big deal. So, again, though, these are at the heart of a lot of these problems. And then you've got your airports. They've also got their large quantities of AFFF, extensive stormwater systems for all of it to drain away, and then these large paved areas where, again, it just is easy for it to drizzle right into the environment. So a lot of large footprints coming from our airports as well. And then, of course, now we're concerned about our drinking water. It's something we're ingesting. So our utilities, historically, when it comes to drinking water, has focused on pathogens, lead, arsenic, nitrates, VOCs. But of course, they weren't focusing on PFAS. It wasn't something that was being thought about. So one study actually found that 45% of U.S. drinking water samples had some measurable level of PFAS. So we've all been guzzling it for decades. If you drink, tap water, probably even some of the bottled water, I'm sure. But now utilities are facing this increased pressure, which, for good reason, but it's going to be tough, measuring parts per trillion for PFAS. But of course, their systems were never designed for this. So, for example, Dallas Water Utilities, they've been evaluating PFAS occurrence in their drinking water systems for a while here, trying to find ways to, again, how are we going to get creative here? What is the cost of this going to look like? What do our monitoring requirements look like? And then, of course, they're also getting public pressure. So those expectations keep rising there as well. So it's both an infrastructure issue and a public confidence issue. And what are you doing to take care of this problem? So utilities are finding, like we said, this is unlike anything else that they treat for. It is fundamentally different. So they've got to look at, okay, where is it entering in the system? Which types of PFAS are present? Remember, there was kind of a different variety there. And we'll look at that here in just a minute again. What treatment technologies are going to work? Probably a multitude of, numerous types in order to address all these different types. And what is this going to cost and who's going to pay for it? Always, the biggest question is what's it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? Which a lot of these answers remain uncertain. So Fort Worth, like we said, they've been doing a lot of work here. It's one of the most active municipalities in Texas when it comes to PFAS planning and response. They're taking a factor approach here. Drinking water, wastewater, biosolids. What does their potential liability look like? They've actually set goals for, I believe it's the local landfills, and they actually have the local landfills, and I don't know the details of this per se. I was hearing from an engineering consultant friend who's involved in this with the city, but the landfills actually have a due date showing they've made some type of effort to reduce PFAS in the leachate. So the city is trying to put out some initiatives here to try to mitigate at least how much PFAS the wastewater treatment facilities are receiving. So 2025, they actually filed a lawsuit. And if anybody's heard about this, Fort Worth filed a lawsuit against 3M, DuPont, the U.S. Department of Defense, and other PFAS manufacturers saying, that question of what's it going to cost and who's going to pay for it. Well, they're saying you need to pay for it. You guys knew that this stuff had, no bueno chemical factors here, and you are still continuing to distribute it and use it and contaminate our drinking water and our groundwater and everything else. So the city of Fort Worth is actually saying, no, thank you. City shouldn't have to pay for it. The public shouldn't have to pay for it. You guys are going to have to fork something over here. So we're trying to recover costs of investigations, monitoring, treatment, plus that remediation process. So more cities are suing them. So like we said, they want to know who's going to pay for this. So this is just a snippet from another article. So under the Biden administration, the EPA adopted regulations requiring cities to reduce forever chemical contamination in drinking water. We'll look at that in just a minute. And when Fort Worth conducted federally required testing in 2023, they found its North and South Holly wastewater treatment plants would violate limits on at least one PFAS chemical capped at 10 parts per trillion. And 16 of those samples were over the 4 parts per trillion for 2 major chemicals. So rather than participating in a 2023 class action settlement, which apparently wouldn't have given them enough money anyways, they chose to pursue legal action and seek $420 million. So they want this money to be able to get these sites cleaned up. And so a lot of other municipalities are looking at doing the same thing here. You know, they've got to get into compliance, these large utilities, for, you know, serving tens or hundreds of millions of, millions of people, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Who's going to pay for that? And they think these industries should have to pay for that. Fort Worth actually ended that Sinagro contract. Remember, those were the folks that were the biosolids processing operations, the stuff that was going out and going to Johnson County. They had a 10-year contract. They did negotiate a settlement to terminate that contract, which, of course, a lot of that was from public pressure. The official reason was, over contract requirements, whether that's, who knows what that's all about. But a lot of it did have to do with the liability, the public perception. And, it's interesting to see how it's already influencing municipal decision making and what this is pushing us towards. So now we're seeing, litigation, great, but what are we going to do about treatment? So, we need the money, but what is it going to look like to actually get this done? So, of course, our first phase is discovery, investigating, litigation. Like, I can't believe this has happened. How are we going to get this cleaned up? Like, you need to help pay for it. And then now we move into, okay, if we do get the money, what is it going to look like for treatment? What new infrastructure do we need? What does compliance look like in this long-term perspective? So our utilities have recognized that regardless of who's paying, these treatment systems are going to have to be built one way or another. But as we know, wastewater treatment facilities as they currently stand were not designed for PFAS removal, especially because we're dealing with multiple PFAS compounds. It's constantly coming into the facility, so this influent loading from all these different sources. And at this point, a lot of the treatment is going to be pretty darn expensive. And then they're dealing with the residual waste management, like the biosolids. So removing PFAS through some methods can also create a second problem. If you are removing it and it's being, somehow concentrated, what are you going to do with that material now? Which in some cases it's got to go and be, for example, incinerated or something like that. So there's just layers upon layers of issues here that are going to have to be addressed. So Fort Worth has already begun on its improvements here. So they did secure a $4 million state loan to start with PFAS removal operations. So they're already trying here. They're already starting to build the infrastructure. So I guess while they're trying to use this, they'll see what happens with their big litigation, lawsuit against those corporations that had distributing a PFAS. Of course, all the other municipalities across the North Texas region are facing the same problems. Arlington, Grapevine, Farmers Branch, Lake Worth, Carrollton, they're all reporting some level of PFAS, in the trillions, of course, in terms of PPT, parts per trillion. But it just goes to show, like we said, this is a regional widespread problem. It's not just a local issue. So the regional cost question is this: what is this going to cost North Texas? Now we got to have all sorts of engineering and monitoring studies. These treatment systems, now new ongoing operational requirements and changes. What do we do with the biosolids, where it's all accumulated? And then those legal costs. So national estimates have come out and said this could cost billions and billions of dollars, which, the chickens have come home to roost 80 years later. But the story is still being written here. So investigations continue, regulations keep evolving, and litigation's continuing to expand. So, you can see the settlements. You got all these, law firms licking their lips because, again, it's only going to become bigger of an issue here, especially in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. So last little bit I have for you, which I know I'm going to go over 12:30, but this is our last little chunk, the regulatory explosion. So as we've seen, there's been for many years basically no regulation at all. Industry has seen it coming and tried to kind of brace for it, but that period is now ending. Now we're seeing, hopefully, depends on the administration, who's in office, unfortunately, but it's nevertheless, we're still going to continue to see a push forward for more environmental regulations. So we're going to move from, contamination to now how do we prevent future contamination through compliance. So as we said, there was a gray area here. It was, there was no regulation. And now we're seeing some development kind of from multitude of angles. We're seeing some new drinking water regulations. We're seeing now CERCLA liability, so Superfund liability. TASCA, or TRI reporting. All of those in terms of, dealing with hazardous substances, those regulations, now we're starting to see a move towards including PFAS. Of course, some state-specific regulations like New Jersey, they are one of the first ones that had drinking water standards. And then permit requirements. So facilities that do have a wastewater discharge permit with the local POTW may now start to see new city-based requirements for testing. So this is becoming a multimedia compliance issue. So EPA, of course, moved pretty aggressively here. Once things did kick into action, I think aggressively is probably too aggressive of a term. It did take them forever. But nevertheless, again, we are seeing movement. So again, we started to see it in our drinking water systems. Now all this new data is coming out on toxicological reports. Now they're getting public pressure. People are getting sued. Widespread environmental contaminations coming out. And so finally, EPA has shifted from just studying it to actively regulating it. So the first, some of these standards we've seen was in 2024. This is our first enforceable national PFAS drinking water standard. So in particular, PFOA, for example, PFOS, 4 parts per trillion for each. So this is what we see driving a lot of our utilities and regulators. So this is a few more here. So again, PFOA, PFOS, maximum contaminant level in drinking water. The standard at this point is 4 parts per trillion. And then we do have a few of those other variations within the PFAS family. Those are at 10 parts per trillion, most of them, or if there's a mixture, they based off of this hazard index. So this is where some of this pressure is coming from for municipalities, because now they've got to kick it into gear and get into compliance. So this is the 2024 drinking water regulation standard. But unfortunately, this is brand new right here. This is May 19, 2026. This is just one article about this. Of course, new administration, new problems. So EPA moves to roll back PFAS drinking water limits. So that's why I said at the beginning, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You're like, for the love of God, just, why is this happening? Which probably there's, industry pressures here. But EPA proposed withdrawing national drinking water standards for a few of these specific types of PFAS. So, for example, when you look at this chart over here showing the PFAS levels in blood compared to national averages, and this is in Lubbock County, of course, in Texas here, you look at, for example, PFHS, XS. So I'm not even going to try to remember what that stands for. But one of the types of PFAS here. So in Lubbock County, they've got 6 micrograms per liter in their blood compared to 1.2, the national standard. But then you look at one of the proposed withdrawn standards is PFHXS. So we've got these people, poor folks out in Lubbock County, that have all of this, type of PFAS in their blood. And then now the environmental regulators are like, oh, no worries, let's just roll it back. You're like, oh my God, that's messed up. So it's crazy. Like I said, we see some movement forward, and then unfortunately we see some movement back. Now EPA is taking comments for 60 days on this in terms of feedback from the public. So, hopefully a lot of us can get in there and leave comments, that are scientifically driven to show them, like, that's unacceptable. That's not the EPA's responsibility, is to, remove those protections. So they will hold a virtual hearing on July 6th or July 7th of 2026 as well. So we're still seeing these developments here. Then, of course, utilities are scrambling to keep up. So by 2027, they're supposed to be in a complete monitoring phase and determining compliance status. So some reporting there they have to do. And then by 2029, they're supposed to be meeting regulatory limits and installing treatment if needed. EPA does estimate $1 billion is going to be needed. So they're investing in this, hopefully to address some of these drinking water standards. But they're estimating between 4,100 to 6,700 water utilities are going to need to reduce PFAS because they're over those federal limits that we currently have. So again, more money, engineering studies, pilot testing, design and construction products. So we saw utilities like the city of Fort Worth, they're already spending money. They're getting loans. So they're trying to do things before, treatment systems are even built. They're trying to take other proactive measures like reducing the amount of PFAS contaminated leachate that's entering the POTW. Now, CERCLA is another important one, of course. So in 2024, EPA designated PFOA and PFOS in particular as hazardous substances under CERCLA, so under the Superfund law. So this turned it from just a water quality drinking water issue to now a liability issue. So this could mean things like, if there's a site investigation done and it's determined that, the levels exceed these regulatory limits under CERCLA, now there may be cleanup obligations. This may be something that needs to be assessed now, and it does, during phase 1 environmental site assessments. Now, those questions do have to be asked. Did this facility ever use PFAS-related chemicals, and they're going to be looking for that because now it holds a liability issue here. So organizations now have to ask themselves, was there any historical PFAS use here? Is this going to be a future liability if we ever try to sell this property? So as EHS professionals, getting towards the end here, why should we care? So obviously, first and foremost, something that's always a pain in the butt, we want to be in compliance. We don't want to have issues with regulators. But of course, it's much more complicated than that because not only are we trying to come in compliance, but it's coming to us from all angles. What does our waste look like? And most of the landfills for the past at least 5 years have already gotten ahead of the curve. They make you do PFAS testing if they're concerned about any type of contamination because they don't want that in their landfill. They don't want to be liable for it. So even though it's not a regulation yet, we're still feeling the pressure. Again, if you've got a stormwater or wastewater permit, there may be new requirements there from the city that they may want to see. Again, phase 1s, phase 2s, anytime we're trying to do some type of property transaction, now PFAS is going to come into the equation. Maybe it's some type of customer audit. A lot of facilities get audited by their own clients, and those clients may be concerned about the liability issues. And same for ESG reporting. So it's touching every area of environmental management, and not to mention the health and safety aspect as well. If you've got people that are, dealing with this material day in and day out, like you think about those people that were out there at the Johnson County sites applying biosolids, what's the dude who's been working there for 10 years been exposed to? So it's an environmental issue and it's that health and safety issue. So we always want to ask, first off, have we ever used AFFF, and start to assess firefighting areas, aircraft hangars, fuel storage facilities, emergency response equipment, and even just general industrial products. So, historical use is probably going to be the biggest liability. Most facilities have tried to phase out use of PFAS products, but we can't rectify the sins of the past. And, now we're left trying to figure out, how do we make this right? And then, as we said, wastewater is going to continue to be the growing issue here. Potential discharge pathways, going to be a part of, permit obligations. So utilities, the cities, are starting to see and identify upstream contributors, which may be your facility. So that may be additional city or municipal specific burden that will now come into play. And of course, stormwater. If it's a facility where there may be, some type of runoff of concern, that may also come into play with a SWIP versus your SPCC. So you may be dealing with both, a SWIP issue in terms of stormwater, but also discharges during spills. We look back at historical spills. Was there some type of fire involved, and could that then have led to a discharge? And then our waste management questions. So like PFAS containing wastes. What are we going to do with those? So in some cases, liquids, they do have, like down in the Houston area, underground injection options. Of course, landfills few and far between that are willing to accept it. Hazardous waste landfills may, but it's becoming tough. Thermal treatment, so through incineration. But even that, a lot of the air emissions that come from that, now they have to deal with PFAS issues there. And then, of course, emerging technologies, there's a lot of acceleration here because people want to solve these problems. And if they can solve these problems, they're going to make a lot of money. So there's incentive there to answer this question. Where does PFAS ultimately go, and what's going to be the most effective way to actually truly get rid of it once and for all when we try to dispose of it? So a lot of money to be made there when that gets determined. And then, as we said, phase ones, mergers, acquisitions, selling the property. Now these questions are going to come about that maybe even 2-3 years ago weren't being asked. But now it's going to be a question that's asked. Is this a concern for this site? And if it is, that property may not sell until it's rectified. And then also supplier and customer pressures. So like we said, you may be getting, a client wants to come visit your site, walk the site. So, common requests might be, hey, we need some type of declaration from you that you don't use PFAS products. They may review that supply chain, risk assessments, etc., trying to make that determination. For example, these companies here, these are the big 12 of the highest or the greatest polluters when it comes to PFAS products. So, again, some clients and customers, as part of their sustainability goals, probably don't, want to be working with a company that uses a lot of PFAS-based materials. They don't want that liability, and it's not part of their goals either. So now it's becoming a business issue as well as an environmental issue. So what does this look like next in North Texas? So again, we're going to continue to see focus on our drinking water and wastewater. What are we going to do with those biosolids? And how does this look like in terms of that agricultural impact, like what we're seeing out in Johnson County? We're going to see developments like with the city of Fort Worth in their litigation suit. Hopefully we'll continue to see developments on infrastructure investments with, the EPA has been trying to invest, but there's going to be a lot more money that's needed from that. And then also, again, going upstream. Who is this material coming from, and how can they reduce PFAS in their discharges or releases? So we're moving from investigation. We've started to identify how this is happening, where it's coming from, but what does it actually look like to fix it? So that implementation stage. But our big questions still remaining unanswered. Who's paying for it? What's going to happen to those biosolids? How should it be disposed of? How are we going to continue to regulate it? And how will these future standards evolve? Again, we just talked about it. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So science is advancing. We're getting more and more information, but these policy questions are going to continue to develop. So lessons from Johnson County. PFAS is not just necessarily a military-based issue, an airport or manufacturing issue. It is now widespread. It's an agricultural issue, livestock, landowner, and a general community problem. So it's much broader than the original source, and that's what makes it so unique. So our key takeaways here. PFAS contamination, it's widespread across North Texas, and across Texas as a whole, and across the country, unfortunately. Now, Johnson County has brought national attention to it and really helped solidify that link between biosolids and agricultural impacts. And we've got a lot of players, a lot of pieces to this puzzle who are involved. We're continuing to see rapid acceleration with those regulatory requirements. Like we said, it's coming from all angles, CERCLA, business perspectives, wastewater perspectives, and then we see these concerns around infrastructure costs, liability, people getting sued. So that's why it's important for us as environmental health and safety professionals. We need to evaluate if your facility or your operations, whatever it may be, look at your risks now. We're not waiting for future requirements. We want to ask those questions now. So if you do phase ones, this should be part of your questions that are being asked. For example, there's some type of acquisition going on, and maybe you're the environmental person, a part of this conversation. Great question to bring up. Do these facilities have any level of, PFAS issues that we should be aware of, in terms of chemicals that have been used, etc., releases, fires. So it's ubiquitous in any, environmental media from all angles here. So we want to be proactive.